A tense week for Zelensky. The president of Ukraine has already left for New York, where he has important meetings scheduled.
This
will be the week of the UN General Assembly with various events and meetings. Our schedule already includes almost 24 meetings with leaders from different countries all over the world.
both
With Ukraine's longtime friends and with new partners. The first meetings are already scheduled for tomorrow. We are also planning a meeting with the President of the United States.
For the meeting with Trump, Ukraine has already prepared a framework for security guarantees, which Europe is ready to accept with the participation of the United States. There will also be discussions about new sanctions against Russia. But what should we expect from the UN General Assembly?
The topic of Ukraine, of course, will also be raised, the Russian-Ukrainian war and ensuring European security. For us, in my opinion, it's not so much the General Assembly itself that matters most, but rather the opportunity for a direct meeting between Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and the president of the United States, Trump.
Earlier, Trump also instructed the ambassador to put more pressure on Europe because it continues to buy Russian oil.
If the nations of Europe were to collectively agree, even temporarily, let's say, to meticulously verify and definitively refuse Russian energy resources, even for a relatively short period of just 6 months, this action would actually cause enormous and significant damage to the Russian Federation's economy, even without the imposition of secondary sanctions against major trading partners like China and India from the European Union.
Tens of thousands of people, estimated by organizers to be around 200,000, attended the farewell ceremony for conservative blogger Charlie Kirk. Among them were Trump himself, behind bulletproof glass, Elon Musk, and members of the presidential administration. Charlie Kirk's wife, Erica, also spoke at the event, after which Trump addressed the audience as well.
As a missionary with a noble spirit and a great purpose, he did not hate his opponents. He wanted the best for them. This is where I disagreed with Charlie. I hate my opponent and I don't want the best for him. I'm sorry, Erica. But now Erica can talk to me and the whole group. And maybe they can convince me that it's wrong, that I can't hate my opponent.
Well, what's surprising is that even the Kremlin didn't stay on the sidelines here. Putin's spiritual advisor wrote an entire post dedicated to Charlie Kirk.
He didn't care about what was fashionable, what was accepted, what the crowd dictated. He allowed himself the rare luxury in our time of calling things by their proper names, even if it meant that such a regal choice would, without a doubt, inevitably be followed by a series of consequences, up to the most terrible ones.
But you might wonder, what does the Kremlin have to do with Kirk's death?
Of course, this is an exceptional play in favor of Trump. Moreover, it is aimed exclusively at the external framework, at making sure that Trump appreciates that the Russian Federation has an exceptionally positive attitude toward his political positioning and supports it.
Two political groups have simultaneously submitted a vote of no confidence against the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And this is already the second vote of no confidence this year. Ursula is being criticized for a lack of transparency in decision-making, for overstepping her authority, and of course for her excessive support of Ukraine.
The far-right forces, the right-wing, the ultra-right, are now trying to influence the position of the European centrists. They are trying to undermine, or at the very least send political signals about undermining, to the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who is actively trying, let's say, to preserve the European service and ensure it meets the current security challenges.
Nevertheless, Ursula's main trump card, and an advantage for Ukraine, is the lack of a worthy alternative. At present, there is not a single candidate capable of uniting support and posing real competition to her.
You are on the YouTube channel Ukraine Today, and in the studio with you is Volodymyr Rabchun. Subscribe to our channel, like this video. It's easy for you, and if you have questions about the release, share your thoughts. We appreciate it. The YouTube algorithms really like it, and it helps promote our content. The topics for discussion for the next 20 to 25 minutes were announced in our segment, so we will now discuss them as well as other topics. Let me introduce the guests who have already joined our broadcast. This is the political scientist and political technologist Ole Pasternak. Ole, glad to welcome you.
Hello.
If you don't mind, I'd like to start with a whole series of meetings scheduled for the coming week, which President Zelensky mentioned in particular. These are both within the framework of the General Assembly and beyond. In particular, the meeting with Trump, which, as far as we know, has not been cancelled yet. Anything can happen, let's put it that way. This time, what could be the format of this meeting? What might be discussed during Zelensky's conversation with Trump?
As a general rule, these particular meetings are always quite brief, because President Trump will surely have a whole series of similar and important contacts besides just Zelensky. And naturally, they don't last very long, and usually such meetings at the General Assembly are not accompanied by any deep dive. They're more about setting some context. Therefore, this will most likely be a meeting where Ukraine needs to achieve at least minimal results in terms of its defense capability and viability. This means continuing to purchase American weapons through FMS programs, as well as through European countries buying weapons for Ukraine. It also concerns further discussions about the future of the peace process and which direction to take, because right now the peace process is in a state of crisis. In other words, it is not moving forward. As you can see, nothing is happening at such rounds of talks in Istanbul. The exchange of prisoners of war has been put on hold. Russia periodically carries out targeted missile and drone attacks. The war continues. And no matter what anyone says, and regardless of how Trump feels about me, or whatever direction the world is moving in toward a more global conflict, as we can see from attacks on Romania, on Poland, on airspace, and so on. Naturally, this creates certain risks and certain opportunities for Ukraine, and this will need to be discussed with the President of the United States.
By the way, in your opinion, how could the events of recent days have influenced the position of the President of the United States of America? And this is precisely in the context of those Russian provocations that we have witnessed.
Look, Trump doesn't want to see them, doesn't want to acknowledge them, doesn't want to comment on them. He avoids it. Let's call him a diplomatic evader of acknowledging reality. Why? It's obvious, because he's smoothing over relations with China. The situation with TikTok, the visit of a House of Representatives delegation to China now for the first time in 6 years. Telephone negotiations with Xi. The prospects of reaching a trade compromise which could turn into a political dialogue are making him act cautiously toward Russia, so that this fragile balance in the Washington-Moscow-Beijing triangle doesn't lead, for example, to a strengthening of ties between Beijing and Moscow. Trump is now trying to implement the strategy I mentioned, improving relations with Beijing in order to rein in Russia. If he truly succeeds, if in the coming months, Trump genuinely manages to move these significant compromises forward in relations with Beijing, resolving long-standing trade disputes, settling complex export control issues, matters specifically concerning NVIDIA, advanced chips, TikTok, and not only those crucial matters, by the way, then the distinct likelihood significantly increases that Trump will indeed be able to effectively use China's substantial assistance to put considerable pressure on the Russian Federation. If not, if this compromise between Trump and Xi cannot be reached, then at the very least, everything will remain exactly as it is now. Russia will undoubtedly try to use this crucial time to break through the Pokrovsk direction and capture the remaining significant part of the Donetsk region, effectively occupying it and then presenting the narrative that, in Russia's view, the primary objectives of their special military operation have been fully achieved. Then perhaps there will be another strong impetus for peaceful settlement, but that is quite likely to happen. And the second option is if Trump simply washes his hands of the whole thing and says the Russian-Ukrainian issue is an unsolvable task for him. It has a system of equations that has no solutions, like in algebra. And no matter what variables you substitute, whatever values you put in for the variables, they don't solve it. And on the contrary, this only leads to serious consequences for Europe in the form of hybrid sub-threshold attacks by the Russian Federation against already strange countries.
Well, okay, we're not just talking about hybrid attacks anymore, we're talking about direct attacks now. That's the situation. That is, in my opinion, it's just half a step to the next attack. In your opinion, how can attempts to improve relations between the United States of America or Trump's attempts to improve relations with Xi Jinping be reconciled with calls for European countries to impose tariffs on China, particularly in connection with the purchase of Russian oil?
It's jealousy, because wanting to see China as the main political and economic rival, the US is of course interested in this big game, aiming for the European Union to become a satellite of the US in the anti-China direction. But here they will make a mistake, because it's one thing to make concessions to Trump in another area, with agreements signed in Scotland and allowing tariffs to be raised on certain goods. But it's a completely different matter to give up their own foreign economy, because the EU and China have very close ties, trade, economic, export and import relationships. And here Trump will definitely face pushback from the European Union. Europe will never agree to synchronize its actions with America against China. On the contrary, it is beneficial for Europe to take advantage of the deepening contradictions between Washington and Beijing in order to present itself as a balanced and strong partner for China and to maneuver between the two centers of influence. And so far, Europe is handling this very well, considering the contacts Europeans have with the People's Republic of China. It's clear that Europe cannot. Of course, they have the opportunity to encourage China to put pressure on Russia to end the Russian-Ukrainian war. And here some kind of joint pressure is needed and to become the White House. This is well understood, but if you mix in the economy here, then any political spectrum of relations and its windows become hostages to these unresolved trade and economic conjunctural issues. This is precisely the fundamental problem. Geopolitics, in a very real sense, collides directly with the global white economy. And this complex situation, of course, inevitably leads to significant contradictions and extremely cautious actions being taken by all involved parties.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Oleg, do you think this could lead to a split between Europe and the United States, or deepen the split that already exists or is emerging? Let me rephrase the question a bit. Is this situation enough for Putin to quietly rub his hands somewhere with a smirk on his face?
Putin has long been enjoying the fact that there isn't the same level of mutual understanding between European capitals and Washington as there was under Biden. In other words, this started a long time ago. This isn't merely a split, it's a profound passion for Trump-style isolationism, which has regrettably led to deeply self-interested and often strained relations between the United States and its European allies. While things are still generally operating within the established framework of transatlantic unity, in certain critical areas and concerning some fundamental principles, we are already deliberately witnessing significant cracks and indeed deep and concerning wounds. This was evident at the very summit. It was noticeable during the August meeting between European and Ukrainian leaders with Trump, and it was apparent in the trade disputes between the EU and the US. Now it is noticeable in their joint anti-China policy. This isn't a split, it's Europe and the US taking separate paths, which sometimes intersect and sometimes diverge. A real split is still a long way off. However, a significant divergence or split is highly probable, primarily because Donald Trump possesses and actively promotes his own distinct set of foreign policy concepts and principles. He operates from a unique worldview and holds specific values that profoundly influence his decisions. Indeed, he is demonstrably and consistently implementing these very actively, meticulously masterminding and diligently striving to pursue his personally chosen course of action on the global stage.
Is this one of the important geopolitical factors that, for example, led Russia to allow itself to carry out the provocations we have seen earlier? That's exactly right, we've come full circle. That is to deliberately violate the airspace of NATO member countries and feel quite confident and even brazen while doing so. This occurred for a significant period, specifically 12 full minutes, within the sovereign airspace of a NATO member country. So,
Putin had been preparing these actions for a long time. I think that the North Atlantic Alliance should have understood that this would happen. This was not a surprise for NATO. Perhaps it was a surprise for the general public, who could not imagine such a bold operation at all. Alright, one or two without a guidance system flew in, as has happened before, like in Romania, or even when missile fragments landed on Polish territory. Therefore, these actions were deliberate. Alex Grinkovich is the Supreme Commander of NATO forces in Europe. At the upcoming conference in Badini in July of the year 2025, he explicitly stated, "The powerful alliance of NATO must be fully ready for a potential war with the formidable nations of Russia and China by the year 2027. In other words, the military leadership of the North Atlantic Alliance, a significant and powerful collective security organization, is fully aware that there is a very serious and escalating conflict looming between the alliance and the so-called axis of evil and the axis of autocracy, a formidable and increasingly assertive geopolitical alignment. This is a conflict, a profound and dangerous confrontation, one that could potentially escalate into a global, widespread, and destructive military battle. And what we are observing and witnessing now is called, in the specialized field of domestic military science, a critical phase known as pre-threshold actions, which are preliminary maneuvers and strategic preparations before an open and full-scale engagement. That is, when the threshold is not crossed, the threshold for qualifying these actions as war, as an incident, as an alarming incident. In American literature, this is called gray zone tactics. This term was introduced by the United States Special Operations Command back in 2015. In other words, gray zone tactics are neither war nor peace, but what is Russia's key objective? They attack Polish targets, finishing by entering Polish airspace, as you correctly noted, for a significant period for 12 minutes. That's certainly enough time to clearly show that they behave as if they are completely at home, but definitely not enough time for NATO to effectively deliver a strong and decisive response. So these seemingly insignificant 12 minutes are actually a very precise, carefully chosen and coordinated period of time that, from a military technical standpoint, serves Russia's interests. So Russia's main objective is not just to intimidate NATO. It's about instilling a sense of fear, testing the strategic weaknesses of the alliance, demonstrating its uncertainty and lack of coordination, not just these goals. Well, for each objective we can assess whether the alliance coped or not. In my opinion, NATO's response was normal and adequate. Well, not sufficient, but adequate. And I'll explain why it wasn't sufficient. But for Russia's main goal, it's to establish a presence in the enemy's territory. That's the purpose of this gray zone tactic, or operations at the threshold of escalation. To mark its presence there and turn it into a psychological effect, primarily for the populations of NATO countries. What does the average Frenchman, Italian, or German think? Previously, before 1940, the alliance was seen as a concrete force, an unshakable guarantee of security, a universal protective umbrella. But now it turns out that Russia is brazenly and freely acting, violating airspace without hindrance. What does the average resident of NATO countries think? That this is clearly not the case, that the former profound confidence is completely gone, the previous deep sense of calm is entirely gone, and the former powerful aura of greatness that allowed them to feel utterly secure and absolutely safe is no longer truly there. That's precisely why there's a rapidly growing and increasingly palpable sense of immense pressure on the government, a profound feeling that they are demonstrably not providing truly adequate and sufficient protection to their citizens. And this critical situation is further significantly amplified and exacerbated by persistent Russian information operations and extensive influence campaigns, which regrettably allow Russia to skillfully present all these complex and challenging events in a highly favorable and advantageous light for their own strategic purposes. Believe me, the European press describes all this in a very discouraging, very skeptical, and even somewhat uncertain tone. So, what should NATO have done? It's very important that, in order to counteract the psychological effect of Russia's actions, there should be symmetrical responses. Okay, closing the border with Belarus. Okay, the Eastern Strike operation to reinforce airspace with British aircraft. These are all reasonable and correct actions. But it's very important that both Putin and the populations of these countries understand. It's necessary to understand the synchronicity of actions. That's why it would have been enough to at least launch NATO reconnaissance UAVs over Russian territory, over the Smolensk region, the Leningrad region, over Veliki Novgorod, over Tver. Let Russian UAVs fly over Russia. It's precisely NATO that should be flying its UAVs over Russian territory in response to Russian UAVs. And NATO doesn't necessarily have to admit that these are its drones. You can always blame it on Ukraine, for example. As for us, we are always and consistently ready, perpetually prepared to deliver to the Russians, our formidable adversaries, yet another devastating and relentless carpet-bombing night, ensuring our unwavering resolve and their continued deterrence. But in that particular case, the international press would undoubtedly write that no, these are still unequivocally NATO drones, and that widely publicized information would at the very least significantly ease the prevailing tension, thereby allowing people to confidently say that they're not just acting in a state of stunned, bewildered defense, but are also very carefully, quite strategically, and in a thoroughly hybrid way, actively advancing their objectives. This is very important. Yes, I understand that this stirs things up. Today, Putin came out with yet another panicked case and even dared to make threats. Today he threatened the West because they understand perfectly well that the West could respond. But now time has been lost. The alliance countries should have acted before Putin's threats today. Then it would have truly looked quite impressive, and Vladimir Putin would have appeared as the side that clearly revealed its own vulnerability indeed. But as it is, time has been lost, the opportunity is gone, and all that remains is deep anxiety and certain actions that benefit the alliance, but do not eliminate Russia's effective advantage, which is now spreading through the information space, where Putin currently dominates with his smirk and brazen face, showing that he has achieved what he wanted.
Well, yes, something tells me that Putin will give more than one chance to respond to Russia's concrete actions, but that's a topic for a separate discussion. Oleg, thank you very much. Thank you for your analysis and for the information you provided. Oleg Posternak, political technologist, joined our broadcast. Thank you. Thank you.